Bill Watson here. Hope you're enjoying these podcasted Bible studies that we've arranged to conduct. You know, the Church of God International has always intended to try to utilize as much of the technology that we have and different methods and tactics that it provides to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And podcasting is really a very valid and legitimate method in utilizing the technologies that are at our disposal. However, podcasting does have its limitations, as you well know. Unlike webcasting, you can't really interact in real time. So what we've done, we've made arrangements whereby you can ask questions or make comments and send them to us via email. That's right, all you've got to do is go ahead and email us at billw@cgi.org, and hopefully this is going to enhance the educational value of the subject that we're covering as we go through the topics in a more specific way, being directed by your questions and your comments. So let's go ahead now, prepare to go back into the book that we're studying, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions. Just email us. Remember, email us at billw@cgi.org.
Okay, I've said my piece. I'm not into that tonight. This afternoon, we are in chapter 9 of Daniel. We are making progress. It's only been a little over 2 years that we've been wading through this book. And I do want to go ahead and get it out on the internet, which we're holding back. I know some of you had inquired about getting the previous presentations to review so that you can go ahead and kind of be brought up to speed for today. Those can be accessed through, I think, maybe, John, you've got them on DVD.
Anybody wants any, just hit me up and I can make a copy of it.
Yeah, because I was thinking about that.
Send them out because we're waiting to release it.
Right.
I do have copies at home.
Okay, so if indeed going forward between chapter 10 and to the end here, which we'll be going into, obviously, God willing, you can get reviews from asking John for DVDs. But we left off back in Daniel chapter 9 and I'm going to pick it up here in verse 20. And we're going to just kind of basically overlap a little bit before we go forward in verses 24 through the end of the chapter, verses 27. In verse 20, we read this, "And while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin," and this is Daniel now, he's giving us a little bit of a blow-by-blow progress report here, what's going on, "and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yea, whiles I was speaking in prayer, the man," and this again, Hebrew word, is ish. It comes from a Hebrew meaning ish, means a man. It's a male vision. It was a masculine imagery that occurred, and it was a strong man look. Even the Hebrew indicates that it could be a steward type or a champion of sort. But at any rate, he was pretty formidable presence in terms of his imagery. And Gabriel, it turned out to be, was Gabriel visiting Daniel. And it says here in 21, "Whom I have sent in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation," which was around the evening sacrifice, which probably would have been late afternoon in this case. The word swiftly means that he had seen him in the beginning at the chapter in chapter 9, but apparently didn't really get a chance to actually understand who it was or what it was. The word swiftly there in my middle margin has even weariness or flight, like a fast, swift flying object at that time. But at any rate, Gabriel slowed down and did materialize. And in verse 22, we see him here where he instructed, that essentially is also the Hebrew meaning of this word, and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I am now come forth to give you skill and understanding At the beginning of your supplication, the commandment came forth, and I am come to show you that you are greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider this vision. Now this is in the first year of Darius, so we are out of the Babylonian rulership. In other words, the Persians have moved in and are now indeed taking control of old Babylon. And consequently, Daniel there is still obviously in captivity along with many of the Jews. Cyrus is, getting ready to do the edicts and the decrees and so forth. But none of that has yet happened. This is still early on in the transition period between the Babylonians and the Persians. And here, Daniel is being told that basically he is indeed a person who's greatly beloved, and is therefore, he wants him, Gabriel tells Daniel, to understand this matter and consider the vision. So 70 weeks, he starts here in verse 24. So let's launch into this now and begin to get into what we were talking about before, where we left off. In verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon the holy city. Here is the SPS, the specific purpose statement of the remaining two verses. Verse 24 is going to lay down the objectives and the goals of what Gabriel wants Daniel to understand. I mentioned this before. I'm going to just reiterate a little bit of this because I think it's important for all of us to refresh this SPS, the specific purpose statements, the objective of this vision. And again, I'm going to ask you a question of what it sounds like to you, because here is what he's saying. He says here in verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon the holy city. And right off the bat, remember, this is 70 sets of 7. And essentially the Hebrew leans toward the day for a year principle that is applied and brought to our attention over in Numbers 14, verse 34. I'm not turning there. I'm just going to reference it. It'll give you the awareness of this 1 year, 1 day for a year principle in prophetic writ, as well as Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 6. Both of those will give you that principle of a day for a year application. And in this case, we have the Hebrew that is characterized, and most scholars will agree with this, and it's most Hebrew scholars will also confirm the fact this is 70 weeks of sets of 7, which would be essentially, when you multiply it out, 490 years. 490 years it comes out to in the full gamut, in the full run, in the full length. So in this 490-year period, we have something that is going to start from where we're at to where we're going. And that's what we're going to be talking about, because what we're going to see here in these basic 4 verses, 24 through 27, is essentially a prophecy that is very well tethered to proving the ministry of Jesus Christ and validating his messiahship. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon the holy city. 1, to finish the transgressions. 2, to make an end of sin. 3, to make reconciliation for iniquity. 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. 5, to seal up the vision and prophecy. And 6, to anoint the most holy. So we have finish the transgression, or the removal of sin, to abolish it. End sin, to make it. Number 2, an end of, to hide, to remove from sight. That was number 2. To reconcile iniquity, to make reconciliation, or to cover, to atone. That's what this is also about. These are the objectives of what we're going to dive into here in verses 25, 26, and 27. And Gabriel, not Daniel, Daniel's listening. Gabriel is introducing this to Daniel and telling Daniel, look, I'm going to give you a message from the other side. And this message is going to take you 490 years in total. And what it's going to do is do these 6 things. It's going to accomplish these 6 things. And number 4 was to bring in everlasting righteousness. In other words, the restoration to full fellowship with God. 5 was to seal the vision and the prophecy, meaning to confirm both are true and will occur, to validate it. And 6, of course, to anoint the most holy, which is to validate the Messiah for who he is. Now, I asked before, I'm going to ask again, what does this sound like to you? Or let me say it this way. Let me change it, because I've mentioned it that way before in part 1. Let me say it this way. Does this sound anything like talking about the beast and the Antichrist? No, not at all. And this is important to grasp before we move ahead, because many of the evangelicals, many of your dispensationalists have the approach, or take the approach, of the fact that as we begin to dive deep and begin to get below the layers in the next coming verses, that we shift, and I'm going to take this slow, step by step, and hope to be able to articulate this clearly to all of us, that they have this disconnected gap of time where they take this particular prophecy, they cut it off, you're going to see this in a moment, and then there's a dead span of time, a gap they call it, in this dispensationalist approach. Hal Lindsey takes it. Others of the evangelical movement will take this approach, and they will say that this gap is the time of the church. Now, Daniel doesn't mention it. The Bible is silent, they say. They say the Bible's silent on this, and that the church is actually now the active body of what's going on in prophecy, and the nation of Israel goes on the bench. And the nation of Israel is not important anymore in this gap period. And yet Hal Lindsey contradicts this very thing by virtue of saying in 1948 that was a prophecy of the nation of Israel, though they got it wrong, but nevertheless he references it and contradicts himself, because in their dispensationalist idea of this gap concept, they claim Israel is in pause. And there's no importance, there's no priority, there's no reason to even be thinking about the nation, because in the gap period, it's all about the church and the growing of the church and the work of the church and so on. And so you'll see how, and I'm going to take it slow here as we go through this, to show you how they shift this and attempt to try to make it say that when in fact it doesn't say that. So here we go, verse 25 now. Know therefore and understand, and he's talking to Daniel now, this is Gabriel talking, that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah, the Prince, shall be, number 1, 7 weeks. 7 times 7 is 49. That's 49 years. 49. And then number 2, he goes on, and he says, the 7 weeks, and 62. That's 62 weeks. And that 62 weeks multiplied by 7 comes out to 434 years. So now you got 49 and 434, and that equals a total of 483 years in that regard. And that 483 years, then, there's still one last segment, and that last segment is this, 62 weeks, the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troubleless times. Troubleless times. So now, take a moment, and you understand that following what happened with Cyrus and his invasion of Babylon, and the decrees, and there's probably about, you could make the case, and many scholars will recognize 4, at least 3, decrees that came out of Persia to give the Jews the green light to go back to their homeland in particular phases and segments. And you can review, I don't have a lot of time to go through the details of all of that, but the point of it is, as you proceed through here, you begin to see that there was a segment where the temple was rebuilt. They went back and they started rebuilding the temple. But they had trouble rebuilding that temple. It wasn't just built in a year or two or three or four or five. There was resistance. There was a drag. There were, figuratively speaking, headwinds that prevented them from making the kind of progress that they would like to make. Notice over here in Ezra, go back with me for a moment to Ezra chapter 4, just real quickly. And the books of Ezra, by the way, Nehemiah and the prophet Haggai. Haggai was all in this duration of time that we're talking about here, of this prophetic time period. And here in Ezra 4, we see a little bit of what was being contended with. We see here in chapter 4, verse 4, and the people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building, and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So going back now to Daniel 9, keep this in mind. It says in verse 25, we have these 70-week prophecy. We've got 69 weeks accounted for in this verse 25. And we're told in verse 25 at the end there, the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And again, you go through the books of Nehemiah, you go through the book of Ezra, you read in the book, the prophet of Haggai, and you will see that this was troublesome times in building the temple, and then let alone rebuilding Jerusalem. That was another whole issue that began to be part of this whole scenario and of what indeed was in fact going on. So this basic 2 of the 3 segments is essentially very important to comprehend, because we still have this last week, the 70th week, the last week. That last week is the one where the dispensationalists take a very distinctive, different approach, very distinctive, different approach than what we would take in this particular case, and how we would understand the scripture to be. And so it says here in verse 26 now, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And they stop right here and begin to introduce the gap theory. Right there at that colon. That colon represents a stop. Christ died, he was cut off, and then from this point on, we move to the end times. We take a quantum leap. We go through a porthole of time, whereby they claim that this next portion of Scripture is all applicable to basically the Antichrist, and of course to the beast and the false prophet, I guess you could say, as well. But the fact of it is, what I want to show you here is that that's not necessarily true. And the way we begin to see this is, I want you to take an approach in this verse 26 for a moment and see how this plays out. Here in verse 26 we read, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And then we continue to read, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolation are determined. And the fact of it is, we know and understand that Jesus Christ was well aware of a prophecy, was he not, of the downfall of Jerusalem, in 70 A.D. Did he not talk about that? He talked about the downfall, that Jerusalem, there wouldn't be a stone upon stone remaining of the temple, and that it would be basically ravaged and taken out, and for all intents and purposes, through the Romans at that case, because we know history, and Titus in particular, just razed that temple and brought it down. And in this particular case, this allusion of a prince that shall come and destroy the city and sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolation are determined. And that's exactly what happened. Desolation occurred. The Jews in Masada, as we well know, ended up their last stand, and from that point on, there was never a Jewish homeland till around 1948, as we understand it, for all intents and purposes. So what I'm saying is, just bear with me for a minute. Let's go just to 27 for a minute, because what the dispensationalists do in this particular case is they say that it shifts to the end time, and the argument becomes, in verse 27, the word he. The take that the dispensationalists take is that the he is the Antichrist. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And that 1 week is essentially the week of a covenant that the Antichrist makes with the Israelis, and of which ultimately, this is what they teach, will be in the midst of that week. Remember, a day for a year, 3.5 days or 3.5 years later, that covenant, that agreement with the Israelis will be broken. And that in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and they apply that to the sacrifice of animals in the end time, which we understand will indeed be implemented and will be stopped. And we understand, and you're going to see that as we proceed through Daniel 10, 11, and 12. We're going to revisit this in a sense as well. But keep the context solidified in your minds. Stay focused on the SPS. Remember, the SPS was, in verse 24, very clearly articulated to accomplish the illumination or awareness of those 6 items. So what we're reading here is, because of that idea of this gap, we got waylaid. We are now going off the reservation of verse 24's SPS, obviously, because there was no mention of this. I mean, we're in uncharted waters here. If Gabriel is explaining to Daniel, this, verse 24, is what the vision is going to mean to you, and now all of a sudden we're not there at all. We're off the rails here. We're off the reservation. We're not within the boundaries of what those 6 items in verse 24 were talking about. So here we have verse 27. Let me continue on this scenario. And he shall confirm the covenant with many, this decree, this agreement, for a week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation and the determined shall be poured upon the desolate. And some have even changed that to mean desolator, which is, again, another spin. So here you've got this stopping and going. You've got this basic meaning of things that are not part of verse 24, so we're off context for all intents and purposes. I mean, we're not, in the eyes and minds of a dispensationalist, no way near the, what you could say, description of what Gabriel intended Daniel to understand when he explained what verse 24 was indeed all about. And so you basically have this, as I say, after the 62 weeks and the 69 weeks, essentially this Messiah being cut off, and they claiming this gap is then inserted right there and at that point. And so from this point on now, we shift into this church era time, which is not mentioned at all. I mean, the fact that we're talking about Messiah and the sins being covered and transgressions and so forth all being eliminated and all of that is the church. I mean, we're talking about how the church is going to function and what is the outgrowth of this sacrifice of this Messiah who's allegedly going to be validated at some point, and of which Daniel's being told, at least the indication would be, is going to have some kind of connection with a 490-year period. And that becomes important. That becomes very important. So let me go back and present to you this for your consideration. In verse 26, we have basically a description of definitely discussion about Messiah. Capital M, there it is. Verse 26, after 62 weeks. So we've had the 7, that's already been fulfilled. That's 49 years. Now we've got 62 more years. Those 62 more years and the first 7 years basically all total out to, or the first, 7 years, all total out to 483 years. 483 years. And in this case, we read in verse 26, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Let me present this as a consideration. And parenthetical statement, we're going to skip over the remaining portion of verse 26 and just read verse 27. So let me start over. Verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of that week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Did Christ cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease? Was he cut off in the middle of the week? So, the fact of it is, not only did Christ stop the necessity of sacrifices and oblations, literally for the day when he died, he stopped it. He split the curtain in two. The sacrifices were stopped for a period of time, not permanently, for that permanently was in 70 AD, but not permanently, but nevertheless temporarily, literally were stopped when he died. And of course, we understand the ramification of his death and the importance of his death and what that all represents. And so we see here that he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of that week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make desolate, even until the consummation, that's his return, and the determined shall he pour out upon the desolate. So certainly he is the all-encompassing, he is the solution to the problem that ultimately provides the sacrifice for us to be able to access, of course, eternal life, but in fact does indeed, in this particular case, and second coming, ultimately take full control and pours out upon desolation upon his return. Now, in verse 26, we have this insert, as I mentioned, a parenthetical statement, of which fits very, very well with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. You have the prince, a small p, a Roman general, Titus, who shall come and destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war, desolation are determined. And of course, as I said before, Masada was in 72 AD, if I'm not mistaken. That's where that last stand was after all that happened with the situation. And it was basically their last stand. And from that point on, as I say, the Jews did not have a homeland. Let me mention this here in terms of a summation. The 70 weeks of Daniel were to begin from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem. In 457 BC, in the 7th year of his reign, King Artaxerxes issued a decree giving Ezra permission to return to Jerusalem to complete the efforts to rebuild the city. And if we go over here to Ezra chapter 7, let's just go over here to Ezra 7 for a moment and see where we're coming from and how we get the year. In Ezra 7, we read here, this Ezra went up from Babylon, and basically you get Ezra's genealogy here in verses 1 through 5, and then verse 6, it breaks into the content of the narrative. Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a ready scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. And the king granted him all his request, according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him. And there went up some of the children of Israel, and of the priests and the Levites, and the singers and the porters, and the Nethinims, unto Jerusalem. In the 7th year, so here we've got a timeline, in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king, and he came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. So here we have, again, roughly most scholars will mention to you that this was about 457 BC. Now, using 457 as a starting point, we will see that during the first seven prophetic years, 49 years, the Jews who returned to rebuild the wall and the city of Jerusalem, despite the efforts of their enemies to thwart their work, which took probably about 50 years in that particular case. It was about a 50-year period that all was involved with here. The Messiah was to come after another 434. So, counting 434 years, and I got my cheat sheet up here for my arithmetic, 434 years from 408 BC brings you, believe it or not, to 27 AD. There's no year zero, because it actually comes to 26, but there's no year zero, so you take that out, it goes to 27 AD. And that marks, of course, we understand the beginning of Jesus Christ's baptism and start his work as the Messiah. The dispensationalists will claim that the cutoff, back in verse 26 of Daniel 9, and this is where they really get into trouble, because they claim that the cutoff was actually beyond his ministry. In other words, it was at the end of his ministry. It was at the end of his ministry. In this particular case, if you look at Matthew 3, where Jesus was baptized by the Baptist at the beginning of his ministry, which would commence the marking of his arrival, not the end, because the dispensationalists will say, well, it was on Palm Sunday when he was coming into Jerusalem to be crucified. That marks the end. Well, that bleeds over then out of the 483 years. And I know this is kind of complex in some respects, but hopefully perhaps on the tape you can kind of slow it down and get it a little bit better to resonate. But with that being said, that transgresses their gap theory, because now they're in their gap territory. They're beyond the 483 years. They're into the 7th week, in other words. They're into the 70th week. They've overlapped into it. The only way this works out, brethren, is that 70th week is indeed part and parcel to confirming Christ and his ministry and being cut off in the middle of the week is of his covenant relationship with the people and humankind, and of course his ministry that we understand to have lasted 3.5 years. So what I'm saying basically in short and in summary basically is that this 457 BC, using it as a starting point, from verses 24 through 27, we get a confirmation that what we're being told here is that Gabriel is sharing with Daniel when the Messiah was going to arrive. You have the kings of the east knowing that this was the time. Remember when they say they came looking, they saw the star, and they came looking for the Messiah. They had rumors about the Messiah's arrival. At the time of Jesus' arrival there, they had an understanding of when he was about to arrive. Did they somewhat understand it? I don't know. I don't know where they had those ideas from, but there's good point and good, I think, rational plausibility, let's say, that they would have understood this particular prophecy to indicate to them that somewhere in that area of 25, 27, 24, 28 AD, this Messiah was going to come onto the grid and begin to do works of God that people would be stunned by and astounded over and basically taken back with, and him being, of course, what would be construed as a troublemaker and a disruptor of the status quo of the religious community. And so the reality of this having to shift this gap theory in and stop prophecy and restart prophecy by using this, really when you look at it, it doesn't have to be that way if you understand that what Daniel's got here are two prophecies. He's got one that the Messiah is coming in 483 years from the time of that decree. And if you back off and go back, you find 457 BC, you find that that's when Jerusalem was being built during the times of trouble, and all of those things were weighing heavy on the Jews at that time. So you have the first 49 years of building the temple and so forth, and taking your timeline through the Greeks, the remaining of the Persian Empire, then the Greeks, and then the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt takes you all the way through that whole intertestamental period to where the New Testament picks up with, of course, the birth of Jesus and the espousal of Mary and Joseph and all of that. Over in Hebrews, let me take you to Hebrews chapter 9 for a moment. We'll be coming up on Passover, and it's always good to remember these things with regard to the sacrifice of Christ, the importance of it, and how he shall confirm the covenant, and many for 1 week, in the midst of the week, shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consumption. And the determined shall be poured upon the desolate. In other words, until he returns. In the meantime, though, look at what Hebrews, and the writing here, says with regards to his putting a stop to the sacrifices and oblations. They were to cease. Verse 23, Hebrews chapter 9. It was therefore necessary, the writer says, that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands, which are figures, they're metaphors, they're analogies, they're types. The temple, the Holy of Holies, all of that was just physical imagery to put you in context with the environs of God's dimension and the spirituality that surrounds God and all of his glory. And he says here, figures of the truth. But into heaven itself, this Jesus, he did not enter into the figures of speech. He entered into heaven itself, the real deal. Now to appear in the presence of God for us. So this was real. This being, this human being, died for us so that he could appear in reality before God the Father, the Holy One, Yahweh, and take the role of high priest that he did under the order of Melchizedek. Verse 25, nor yet that he should offer himself often. He doesn't have to go through this every year. As a high priest and enters into the holy place every year with blood of others, which is the type, the figure of speech, going back to the metaphor on earth that the Levites had to do. Verse 26, for then must he often have suffered. If that would be the case, then he'd have to often suffer since the foundation of the world. But now, once, at the end of the world, I like that, 2,000 years ago, he's saying the end of the world. Yeah, but now, once, in the end of the world, has he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear a second time, without sin, unto salvation. Now continue on here, chapter 10. And let me just drop down here to verse 16. Chapter 10, verse 16. This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I'm going to put my laws in their hearts and in their minds, and I will write them. And their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. Now where remission of these is, there is no more offering for sin. Christ did it once. That's the offering. We don't need to be sacrificing lambs anymore. We don't have to be involved in thank offerings and sin offerings and all the things that went with the offertory laws and regulations that managed that particular segment of the laws of God. This was pointed to by the prophets. This was articulated by Daniel in his writings from a message he got from Gabriel, who entertained him with this information and brought it from the spirit dimension to affirm, let me go back, these 6 things. Finish the transgressions, removing of sin, abolishing it. Jesus did that. End sin, to make an end of, to hide, to remove from sight. And Jesus ultimately, remember, he's going to come for the restitution of all things. Ultimately, Christ is going to be the restitutioner of all things and will indeed remove sin even after the millennium when we're all in God's kingdom as spirit beings. And that's the even bigger picture. But again, to this context in verse 24, these things Jesus Christ was purposed to do, and of which Gabriel is telling Daniel, this is what the message is all about, Daniel. Number 3, reconcile iniquity, to make reconciliation, to cover, in other words, to atone, to be able to cover sin, take it upon himself. And then with the restitution of all things, as portrayed in the Day of Atonement, where those, through the laying on of hands, and basically holding Satan, the devil, accountable for the sins, will be then dispersed. And Jesus, it's not fair for him either to carry sin out into eternity. I mean, who's really responsible for sin? It's not Jesus. Satan, his minions. They were the ones that created and caused the first sin to occur, and of which has never been accounted for yet. Satan is still not held, still has not been brought to trial, still has not been imprisoned in the sense of being formally charged with what he's done. That deal, that situation, is still yet unresolved. The day is coming, as the Day of Atonement portrays, when he will be held accountable, and that accountability will indeed sentence him for all eternity to his destiny. But here, in verse 24, it goes to this point, fourth reason, to Jesus to bring everlasting righteousness and restoration, to full fellowship with God. So as Christ covers us, we have restoration and full fellowship with God, because we have opportunity through his priesthood, through the order of Melchizedek, to develop a relationship with the Father. And as Ed was mentioning today, with the Holy Spirit being our empowerment, have a direct tether, a direct line through Christ to the Father. And so it becomes important that we see he is a restorer to full fellowship with God the Father. And fifth, to seal the vision of prophecy, to confirm both are true and will occur, and to anoint the most holy, to validate the Messiah for who he is. And the prophecy that is referenced here, brethren, I submit to you right here in verse 26, the latter half, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city, the very city that they are about to rebuild, prophetically speaking, was going to be destroyed again. That's what Gabriel told Daniel, and that's what Jesus told his disciples. There would not be a stone upon stone remaining. And sure enough, not more than about 40 years later, after Christ ascended back to the Father, Jerusalem, in Israel, came tumbling down. And consequently, the sacrifices and everything were disrupted and essentially eliminated at that time. And as pointed out here, destroyed the city, Jerusalem, And the second temple was destroyed, the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And again, as I say, don't want to belabor it, but the Jews then were run off, and from 72 AD, technically speaking, they were a diaspora, for lack of a better term, throughout the world, and ended up being salt and peppered as an ethnicity among many, many ethnicities around the world. Finding them little pockets and neighborhoods, like in Poland and Austria and so forth, and all these areas in Europe, and ultimately here in the United States as time went on. So basically then what I'm saying here is that this takes us to the validation, and in short, the ministry of Jesus Christ that begins at 27 AD, commences, according to most scholars, in 457 BC, of which connects up with Ezra chapter 7, Ezra chapter 7 in that particular case. So it's an interesting point. Gabriel leaves Daniel, and of course Daniel is, I'm sure, somewhat mesmerized at all of this, but thankfully he wrote it down for all of us to be able to appreciate and understand, so that we could know really the stepping stones of how Christ is indeed the recognizable Messiah, and does in fact come with the credibility of being that one who came down from God through that 490-year period here as described by Gabriel. Now, moving on, chapter 10. Just want to touch on this as a little introduction. 10, 11, and 12, which we're coming round and third and heading home here, are some of the most complex and detailed prophecies of geopolitical arrangements, machinations, intermarriage, families, kings and prime ministers and countries being shared through marriage. It's amazing. It is amazing on what is described here. And as I've often said, who is that? Nostradamus has nothing over the Bible, because some of these things, when you get into some of the details and nuances of some of these prophecies and how they were portrayed so many hundreds, if not in some cases thousands of years before they happened, and yet they happen, is just an amazing thing. So here in chapter 10, 11, and 12 is almost like a block. You're going to see a lot of visitation again going on. These angels were breaking the veil right and left. Gabriel, Michael, they were in communication. Some of them was somewhat intimidating, as you'll see here in chapter 10. It was somewhat stunning. Mary, remember how Mary was frightened when Gabriel showed up to tell her that she was going to be impregnated by the Holy Spirit. And when you read the Greek there in the New Testament, you find that she was literally shaking. She was really upset and affrighted over the advent of this being coming through into her reality, and claiming that she was well respected and admired by God, and that she was chosen to be the vessel to carry his son. Can you imagine that? That's just mind-blowing to realize that somebody would have that kind of respect and admiration from God to be chosen for such a special job or special opportunity to serve him in. But here in Daniel 10, I'm just going to hit a high spot here in verse 11. Again, you're going to see the angel, and again, most likely Gabriel here, is stated as saying that he says, unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto you, and stand upright, for unto you am I now sent. And when he had spoken this word unto me, I stood, but trembling. His knees were knocking still, because this was quite an event. But here we go back into chapter 10, And we've moved up a few years. Remember, Darius, there in chapter 9, puts us at about 539 BC. Here we are in chapter 10, and we're in the third year of Cyrus, which would put us at about 536 BC. King of Persia, a thing was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, and the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, way out there. And he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks, or as stated, weeks of days. He was actually 21 days in his mourning and in his condition. And he ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine to his mouth, and neither did he anoint himself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled, 21 days. And in the 4th and 20th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel, which many claim is the Tigris, up there by Iraq. That's where this all happened, up there in Iraq, the Iraqi area there. And he says here, I lifted up my eyes, I looked, behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. And his body also was like this beryl, his face as appearance of lightning, his eyes as lamps of fire, his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. And here again, this goes back to that presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago with the advent of us not really knowing what an angel looks like in his spirit form. This here is a manifested form, a manifestation of an angel who breaks the veil again and materializes, manifests so that human beings can see him and can live, through the experience, so that they themselves are not burned up or eliminated for all intents and purposes. So we're going to pick up here in chapter 10 on the next session, probably next month, and pick up right from here and begin to launch into chapters 10, 11, and bring it to a close in chapter 12 as we go into the latter days, And I'm going to go back a little bit too and revisit Daniel 9 on the next session, because I want to add something that I did not want to put on this particular part. But with that, questions? Anybody? Any comments or anything? I know it's a lot. I'll tell you, it's the arithmetic and the overlays and the divisions. I mean, even with a blackboard or an overhead is somewhat. It was difficult for me to comprehend in some regards, but hopefully on the disc or when it's posted, you can stop it and go back and stop it and go back and kind of let it, maybe get a pencil and paper out and do the math. But that's quite a prophecy, and it's such a validation of Jesus' messiahship. And if anything else, it ought to be encouraging to all of us, really should, that Jesus Christ is indeed the Son of God, is alive at the right hand of God. He is alive. He's coming back. He's on a countdown from heaven. He's going to come back. He's going to reclaim his own, and that reclaimed will be changed in a twinkling of an eye. The spirit beams caught up into the air, landing with him at the Mount of Olives. Great future. Keep that vision, brethren, as we go forward, because we're going into some pretty strong headwinds, needless to say, and some of the things that got on the grid and some of the things that you're already seeing beginning to come up in the distance and on the horizon are going to be pretty tough going forward. So stay close to God. Really stay close to God in these days. If you ever needed a motivation to stay close to God, just look around you, because you should be motivated to stay close to God in today's day and age. All right, that's the end of part 2.
Fellowship, the new social media network for the Sabbath-keeping Church of God community. Available in Apple App Store and Google Play Store.